Hello, so this recording follows up the preliminary session on interviews with a focus specifically on interview design. So one of the things that you will have in an interview is some form of interview schedule, which can be quite loose or more structured. Now, I would generally guide novice researchers who haven't done a lot of interviews before to use a fairly structured interview schedule. This is still what we'd call a semi-structured interview because you might not ask the questions in that order, but I would try to, emphasise that you have, a fairly good list of questions to help guide you through the interview. Now, there's all sorts of different ways this can be organised, but as you can see on the left-hand side there, I've suggested a typical layout, which is you go through a series of themes. So for each theme, you might have an initial question or series of questions, and then you might have some probes, which could be sort of prompts that you use to try to get people to talk about certain things that you're expecting to come up. And so you go through theme by theme. And within your interview, you might cover 3 or 4 main theme areas, which would have several questions. And apologies, my cat's joined me again, and she's rather wet because it's chucking it down with rain outside. There are lots of other variations. I've put a couple up there. Narrative interviews, I think I mentioned in the overall session on doing interviews. These are ones where you try to encourage people to tell a story. And, so you have questions that focus on tell me about. And in fact, in a very pure narrative interview, you only have one question at the start, which is tell me about whatever it is you're particularly interested in. And then, everything that follows from there is a conversation around that one topic area. But I wouldn't sort of recommend just having the one question as a novice researcher. Then you have things, people refer to things like tree and branch interviews, which actually are not that dissimilar to what I suggest on the left-hand side there, where you have a theme and certain questions. But with a tree and branch, you tend to you ask a question, which is one of your branches, and then depending on the different answer options that people give, you might, go through and, till you get to the twigs, presumably, in terms of breaking it down into specific areas that you follow through in that interview. In terms of asking questions, we typically use things like what, how, or why questions, and these tell me about questions. So you can use tell me about questions even if you're not doing a narrative approach. I use them quite a lot because I find them quite a helpful way to frame questions that are open-ended. And when you say tell me about, it encourages people to talk and give you a lot of detail in their answers. Closed questions we can use in an interview, but I would use them very sparingly. So closed questions have, almost kind of one-word answers. So the very limited answer that people can give. So if you ask someone, how old are you? I'm 53. That's it. That's my answer. It doesn't take you anywhere. So we have to ask some closed questions because, for instance, we might want to know how old our participants are. We might need to know some details about them, and we would typically ask these closed questions. But then that might lead into more open-ended questions. And at the bottom there, you can see we can have scenarios. So one way to talk to people about some things is to give them scenarios. Now you have to bear in mind this can lead participants. So for example, I might use scenarios. In my PhD, I was looking at travel and tourism and transport and tourism, and I talked to people in a particular area about congestion problems that were caused by tourism. And one of the things I said was, I understand from other participants that there is a lot of congestion in this particular place. Can you tell me about your experience of this? And so I kind of had set it up as sort of, I understand there is this particular scenario of congestion here. So that's one way you can use scenarios. But you can often put scenarios another way. You can give them a little vignette, a little story that sort of says one scenario of this is such and such, and explain that and then get them to talk about that. But you have to remember that you do tend to lead people. So in terms of thinking about open questions, these are some examples here. So how did you feel after the event was over? So maybe you're wanting to capture something on people's post-event experiences, and maybe something about their sense of euphoria or maybe disappointment after the event had happened. What made the experience in Chamonix so special? So maybe you'll be doing some research about a particular tourism destination, and you want to understand, what was the really positive features for them, or why did you leave the beach early? So, I don't know what kind of context this might be, but, if you're researching something in tourism and perhaps people were leaving because it was crowded or wet or something like that, and you want to explore that more. Or tell me about your ticket purchase experience. So maybe people were purchasing a ticket to go to a live event or, for a holiday, and, that's what you're interested in. But all of these questions, what they all have in common is they invite people to tell you quite a bit, so they need to give you an explanation about why they left the beach earlier. They need to talk you through their ticket purchase experience. And then closed questions. These are the kinds of things you want to avoid. And what I find is that when students initially write interview schedules, they tend to write closed questions like this because they don't realise the implications of them. So, for instance, did you enjoy the restaurant? On face value, the answer to that is yes or no. Possibly, maybe, partially. And actually quite a lot of people, if you ask that question, they will talk to you about it. They will do more than answer yes or no. So did you enjoy the restaurant? Yes, I did. I particularly liked the food. I liked the ambience there. I enjoyed the other people. They might answer it as an open question, but a lot of people will just go, yes, it was great, and that was it. You will get very little out of them. Whereas if you were talking to them and saying, tell me about your experience at the restaurant, then they will say, oh yes, I really enjoyed it. I particularly liked it, and they will go through all of that kind of stuff. So avoid this kind of did you. So do you, did you questions are closed. Would you go to the festival again? Yes, no. It doesn't invite people to explain it. Whereas if you sort of said to someone, tell me about your plans for this festival in the future, or tell me about your plans for going to this festival in the future, it becomes an open question and they talk to you. Do you consider yourself an autocratic manager? Is another do you kind of question. Has a yes, no answer. These ones you really want to avoid. These aren't the kind of things you want to ask. Now, arguably, you could ask questions like, would you go to the festival again? If you just want to find out if they will or wouldn't, and then talk more about that. But, so you might want to actually use that as a way to kind of segment them into a group. Okay, I'll talk to them more about this. The ones that say no, I'll ask these questions. So you do sometimes have to ask them, but avoid them as your main questions. Other questions to avoid, very long questions. I can be a bit of a master of this, and I need to actually, check myself, but try to keep things short and simple. The person you're interviewing will get lost if you have quite a long, complicated question. And then we have what's called double-barreled questions, where you ask more than one thing. Tell me about your experiences of going to the cinema, and then what you did afterwards when you went for a meal. And it's like they immediately just focus on one or the other, usually the second part of the question, and forget the first part. Split it into two separate questions. Questions avoiding jargon. You often understand jargon, but your participants often don't. So just make sure you're not using words or terms which are very meaningful for you as a student studying the topic, but not very meaningful for your participants. Avoid leading questions, where you kind of leading questions are questions where you lead people to particular answers, so where you make it sort of assumed that a particular answer is positive. And biased questions, so maybe when you start saying something like, maybe you're looking at gender in sport, you start from a position that women's sport isn't as exciting as men's, which is complete rubbish anyway, but you might be actually biasing the answers in some way through the way you've approached it. Lots of ways we can prompt people. You don't necessarily have to ask questions to prompt people. So things you can do is repeat the question, because people might go off on a slightly different tangent, and then you just sort of take them back to it and just sort of say, what I was interested in here is, and you just go through the question again. You can repeat the respondent's reply. So something they've said, you can actually repeat that back to them. So you can sort of say, so you're telling me that women's sports has got some image problems, and then they can talk more about that. Asking a question that focuses on a point made by the respondent. So this is where I keep notes. So the respondent said something and I want to know more about that. So then I go back to that and say, earlier on you mentioned such and such. And actually sometimes your later questions you can even insert whatever that thing is. So in an earlier question you explore something, and whatever the answer is to that question, that gets inserted into a later question. But as you go along, you can actually pick up on something they've said and ask about it. Be quiet sometimes. Use a pause. Okay, so we tend to fill silent space when we're talking to people. Actually try not to do that. Just stop for a moment. Wait till someone answers. And you can boost or reassure the respondents to say, that's very interesting. I'd really like to know more about that. That's exactly what I'm looking for, that kind of thing. You can elicit clarification. So they've mentioned something you don't quite understand, or maybe you do understand, but actually you just want to talk about it more. So, can you clarify what you said there? You can also contradict or challenge people, though I wouldn't recommend that in novice interviews. So, where you can actually present a contrasting point of view, but that's quite difficult to manage. You can link things together. So earlier on you mentioned such and such, now you're talking about this. Are those linked at all? You can even ask them directly about that. And you can fake puzzling. Don't quite understand there, so they will then talk to you about it more. So there's lots of different things you can do. So now what I would suggest, if you're undertaking interviews, would go and have a good read around this in the textbooks, and it will give you lots of other ideas for how to build your interview schedules.